Now, step number 2 is about those environment variables. And that's a very useful feature since it allows us to use different values in parts of our code during development and production. And Next.js has built-in support for environment variables. Now, to explore them, I actually want to explore another concept first, though. We can configure Next.js. Up to this point, this Next.js project worked with all the default settings Next.js assumes. And these are sensible defaults, which often make sense. But maybe you want to fine-tune them. And you can do this by adding a special file to your project, a next.config.js file. This is a special file which has to be named like this and which has to sit in your root project folder if you add it. And it's a file which exports a JavaScript object with this Node.js export syntax. If you never worked with Node.js, you might not know this syntax. This is in the end the equivalent to export default in front-end JavaScript, so to say. So we export such an object here. And that's now an object which allows you to set various configuration options. Now, if you Google for next config, you'll find the official documentation on that config file. And here you learn all about that file and what you can configure there. You can configure a lot here, but for most of the settings, the defaults are fine. But you can, for example, add environment variables, something we'll do in a second. You could add a base path if you're hosting your Next website not on the root level of some domain, but in some nested path. You can set up rewrites and redirects if you have some hard-coded redirects which should be taken into account when the application is deployed, and much more. You can inject your own Webpack configuration to really tap into that build process. You can disable compression. It's enabled by default, but you can disable it if you don't want to use it for whatever reason. Compression will make your JavaScript files and so on smaller, so you should enable it by default, and much more. So you see, there are a couple of things you can set, but to be honest, most of the settings will rarely be needed, and you will know when you need them. The most helpful settings are probably redirects and custom headers and environment variables and the base path. For this project, though, we need no rewrites, we don't need to change the base path, we don't need any custom headers, but we will explore environment variables. And the idea really is that in our API route here, we swap out some of these values here from this connection string for dynamic values, which can then differ between development and production, so that we can have a development database connection and a production database. And we don't delete or manipulate production data with our development tests. And to make that work, I'll go to that next config file and add the env key. That's also what you see in the official docs here. This allows you to set up key value pairs of your choices, and you will then be able to use your keys in your code, both in the API routes as well as in any other component. So you can use your environment variables anywhere in your code base. So here I'll set up a couple of environment variables, and I'll start with MongoDB username. Now, how you name that variable is up to you, but I'll name it like this. And set this to Maximilian. Then add the MongoDB password and set this to the password I have here in my connection string. Then I'll add the MongoDB cluster name. And here I will use this cluster 0 thing here, so that if I had multiple clusters in my account, I can use different clusters for different environments. So I'll add this here. And then I'll also add the MongoDB database key. And here I want to grab that database to which I'm connecting, my site, and set this here. Now you might be wondering why I'm doing this here. What's the benefit? The benefit is that now we can tap into those values. We'll do that in a second. And when we then deploy our application, we can override these values. And you'll see how we can override them in a couple of minutes once we deploy. And therefore, we now need to switch to using environment variables. So back in the API route, I'll now set up my connection string here in a separate constant, simply to make it a bit easier to work with it. And I'll set up a template literal here, because now I need to mix hard-coded and dynamic values. And I'll still start with that MongoDB plus SRV part here. But then after the 2 slashes, I want to inject the value from my environment variable, from that MongoDB username environment variable. And here we see in the official docs that we get access to those values by tapping into the global process variable, which is exposed by Node.js, then .env, and then into the key name of our choice. Now this placeholder will be replaced with the concrete value during the build process. That's important. So this will not be resolved dynamically after we build the app, but it will be swapped out during the build process. And that allows us to replace it with our environment variable value, and it allows us to use different values for building for production than during development. But again, we're going to see this in a second. So therefore now, in contact.js here, I now want to use process.env.mongodb username here. Then we have a colon here. So this is hard-coded, and thereafter the password, which we get from process.env.mongodb_password. And here I'm using the keys I set up in my env part of that configuration. Now we also want to replace the cluster and the database. So back here in contact.js, now we have an @ after the password. And then the cluster name. So here I want to tap into process.env.mongodb cluster name. Then thereafter I have this hard-coded part. So I'll add that here again. And then inject process.env.mongodb database. And then thereafter add this query parameter. Like this. Okay, so now that's our dynamic connection string. That's now what I'll use here for connecting, the connection string. And now here we use environment variables. Now that should work. If I now start the development server again with npm run dev, we should again be able to successfully test everything. Specifically, I should still be able to send a message here. This should still work. Let's see. Send message. Success. And we got no error here either. So that works. And now we're using environment variables. Now, environment variables are only helpful if we don't always use the same values. And at the moment, the only thing we did is that we moved these hard-coded values from contact.js into next-config.js. But there, they are still always the same. At the moment, we don't differentiate between production and development. Now, there will be certain hosting providers which allow us to push our code to them, and then they will do the build for us, and then there we can define different environment variables, which they should use during the build process. And we'll see an example for this later. But we're not necessarily always using a hosting provider that does the build for us. And therefore, in next-config.js, we can actually define different values for the environment variables for the different phases we might be in. To be precise, when we run npm run dev to start the development server, we clearly are in development. Our current phase is development. If we run npm run build, though, to trigger the next build script, or if we run the export script, which I explained a couple of minutes ago, then we are clearly building for production, because that's the idea behind next build and next export. So then our phase is production. We want to use the production values. And because we have this clear way of telling Next.js whether we're building for development or production, Next.js allows us to define different sets of configuration values for development and production. For this, we just need to import something, and we do this with this strange-looking import syntax, which is the default Node.js import syntax. And we have to use it here in this config file because this config file is read in a way that other import statements won't work yet. Here we need to import from next constants and make sure you import exactly like this with the require function on the right side of the equal sign. And then here we can import different phases. To be precise, we have the phase development server, which will be used if we run npm run dev. We have the phase export, which will be used if we do that export command. And then we got the production build and production server. Production build will be used if we run npm run build. And production server will be used after that build for the server-side code once our server is up and running. So what we could do here is we can import that phase development server and then utilize the fact that our exported thing here in this config file can be an object, but can also be a function. And I'll change this to a function which returns this configuration object then. So we move that into this returned object now. And I'm doing this because when using the function form, we can add an if check to check in which phase we are. So if this configuration is loaded for the development server or for production. And we can find out in which phase we are because this function here will be executed by Next.js and it will get the phase parameter. And then we can check if the phase for which this config file is being read in, if that is equal to phase development server. And then we can say if that's the case, if we are in development, then we want to return a different config object than we do otherwise. So now here, I'll grab these settings and add them here. And now that's my configuration object for this Next.js project if we are in development. If we make it past this if check, we are not in development. And in all those cases, I could now set up different values here. For example, I could use a different database. I could say here, I'm not using my site, but my site dev during development, and then I use my site in production. If we change everything like that and we save this file, if I start the development server again with npm run dev, then we'll see that if I reload this context page and I now do test this again, it should still work. But if I then log into MongoDB and explore my collections, what we'll see is that once this loaded here, that we now have this my site dev database with a messages collection, and that collection contains our one message. For some reason it doesn't load here for me, but we can see that there's one document in there, and we can clearly see that it's the right database name. So now we're using this during development, and we'll use different settings for production. And that allows us to not accidentally override or mess with data from our real users during development. And that is why environment variables can be very useful and are another feature you should be aware of.